everyone, welcome back to LMJ English, your home for learning English through powerful and emotional stories. Today we're diving into the extraordinary life of Abraham Lincoln, a man who rose from poverty to lead a nation through its darkest hour. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell so you never miss another inspiring story. Let's learn English through history, one story at a time. Early life and education. On February 12, 1809, beneath a sky full of winter clouds and the soft rustle of Kentucky woods, a baby boy came into the world. He was born in a one-room log cabin on the sinking spring farm near Hodgenville, Kentucky. The cabin was no bigger than a small modern room built with rough wooden logs, dirt floors, and no glass in the windows. The baby was named Abraham Lincoln. No one could have guessed then, not even his weary parents, that this fragile child wrapped in old cloth would one day become one of the greatest leaders the world has ever known. Abraham's father, Thomas Lincoln, was a hard-working but poor farmer, a man of simple ways and few words. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, was gentle, thoughtful, and deeply spiritual. Together, they struggled to make a life in the wild frontier lands, where danger, disease, and hunger were constant visitors. The Lincolns had little money, few possessions, and no access to modern comforts. Their cabin had no electricity, no bookshelves, and no school nearby. Yet in the heart of their son, something extraordinary was beginning to stir, a quiet flame that no hardship could put out. When Abraham was just 2 years old, the family moved to a nearby farm, and soon after, they would face an even more difficult decision. Because of disputes over land ownership and the increasing influence of slavery in Kentucky, Thomas Lincoln moved his family north to Indiana in 1816. It was a land without slavery, but also without much civilization. They settled in a place called Little Pigeon Creek, surrounded by thick forests and wild animals. It was there, in the shadow of tall trees and under a sky filled with stars, that Abraham began to grow. Life in Indiana was tough. There were no schools nearby, so Abraham learned by listening, by observing, and by reading whenever he could find a book. And books were rare. But to young Abraham, a book was a treasure chest filled with adventures, wisdom, and possibility. He read everything he could find, even if it was a single page torn from a newspaper or a borrowed book from a traveling neighbor. His favorites included the King James Bible, Aesop's Fables, Robinson Crusoe, and the Pilgrim's Progress. These stories didn't just entertain him. They shaped the way he thought about life, truth, and justice. But life did not go easy on him. In 1818, when Abraham was just 9 years old, tragedy struck. His mother, Nancy, fell ill with a mysterious and deadly condition known as milk sickness. Within days she was gone, and Abraham was left in sorrow. He remembered her as kind, soft-spoken, and full of love. Her death left an emptiness in his heart that never quite healed. For a time, his older sister Sarah tried to care for him, but she too would later pass away, leaving Abraham to walk through grief once again. In 1819, his father remarried a widow named Sarah Bush Johnston, who brought her own children and a sense of warmth into the Lincoln home. She immediately recognized the bright spirit in young Abraham. She encouraged his learning, protected his books, and treated him with affection. Abraham came to love her deeply, calling her Mother for the rest of his life. Her support became the light he needed during the darkest hours of his childhood. As he grew, Abraham proved himself to be both physically strong and intellectually curious. He helped with the farm work, splitting logs, planting corn, and building fences. But his heart belonged to ideas, not axes. People around him began to notice his storytelling abilities, his clever mind, and his strange habit of scribbling. Notes and quotes on wooden boards, leaves, or even the walls of his cabin when paper was not available. When he turned 21, Abraham left home to find his own path. His journey would take him from the lonely woods of Indiana to the sunlit fields of Illinois, and eventually to the capital of a divided nation. But he never forgot the log cabin, the dusty roads, the books read by firelight, or the faces of those he loved and lost. His early life, full of hardship, sorrow, and hope, carved into him the empathy and strength that would one day guide a broken nation back to unity. Early career and political rise. When Abraham Lincoln stepped out into the world as a young man, he carried with him no money, no title, and no powerful family name. What he had instead were his long arms, a clear mind, and a growing belief that he was meant to do more than plant corn or chop wood. At 22, he left his family and made his way to New Salem, Illinois, a small rough frontier town where dreams were few but possibilities still flickered like candlelight in the dark. He began his adult life doing whatever work he could find. He helped build fences, split rails, and ferried goods on flatboats down the Mississippi River. On one of these journeys to New Orleans, he saw for the first time the cruelty of slavery up close. Men and women being bought and sold like animals. The sight haunted him, and though he said little at the time, something inside him changed. Back in New Salem, Abraham found work at a general store. Though he had no business experience, his honesty, storytelling charm, and natural wit made him a favorite in the town. He was known to walk miles just to return a few pennies to a customer he had accidentally shortchanged. People began calling him Honest Abe. But business was unstable. After a failed venture owning a store with a partner, Abraham was left with debts he would spend years repaying. Yet he never ran from responsibility. He paid every cent. Then came the Black Hawk War in 1832, and Abraham volunteered to serve. He was elected captain of his company, not because of military experience, but because the men trusted his leadership. Although he never saw battle, the experience gave him a sense of discipline and deepened his respect for duty and sacrifice. Years later, he would say with quiet pride that being elected captain gave him more satisfaction than any office he ever held. After the war, Abraham tried something new: politics. He ran for the Illinois state legislature. He was unknown, had little education, no wealthy backers, and lost the race. But he didn't give up. Instead, he studied harder, read law books borrowed from friends, and started to shape his speaking skills. He worked as a postmaster and later as a county surveyor, walking across miles of prairie land, all while keeping a law book in his coat pocket. In 1834, just 2 years after his first political defeat, Lincoln ran again for the Illinois House of Representatives, and this time he won. It was the beginning of his political rise. In the state legislature, he represented Sangamon County and began to find his voice as a lawmaker. He stood tall, both physically and morally, and became known for his clear logic and deep sense of fairness. He served 4 terms in the Illinois legislature, aligning himself with the Whig Party. He supported internal improvements, like canals and railroads, and believed in expanding opportunities for ordinary Americans. Though he opposed slavery, he didn't yet call for its immediate end. Instead, he hoped it could be contained and eventually fade away. It was a cautious position, but one shaped by both his conscience and the complex politics of his time. At the same time, Lincoln pursued a career in law. With no formal schooling, he studied independently and passed the bar in 1836. He moved to Springfield, the state capital, and began practicing law. His reputation grew quickly. He had a gift for storytelling, a sharp cross-examination style, and an ability to connect with juries. People traveled from across counties just to watch him speak in court. Though his suits were often wrinkled and his appearance humble, in the courtroom he stood like a giant. As he worked in law and politics, Abraham Lincoln began to develop not only a career, but a vision. A belief that America could be better, that fairness, justice, and opportunity should not belong only to the rich or powerful. From a dusty store in New Salem to the chambers of the Illinois legislature, Lincoln was no longer just a curious boy from a log cabin. He was becoming a man of principle, rising step by step toward a destiny greater than he could yet imagine. U.S. Congress and return to law. By the mid-1840s, Abraham Lincoln had built a solid reputation in Illinois as a sharp lawyer and honest politician. His speeches were thoughtful, his manner humble, and his character steady. People trusted him, not because he was flashy or powerful, but because he listened, reasoned, and spoke with heart. In 1846, Lincoln took another bold step in his journey. He ran for a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. This time his quiet persistence paid off. He won the election and traveled to Washington, D.C. to represent Illinois in the 30th Congress. For a man who had grown up reading by candlelight and splitting wood with calloused hands, entering the halls of Congress was a remarkable leap. But Lincoln was not dazzled by power. He stayed true to his values. As a member of the Whig Party, he supported internal improvements, like building roads and canals, and economic development that could help everyday Americans. Yet it was his position on the Mexican-American War that would define his short time in Congress. While many politicians eagerly praised the war as a chance to expand America's territory, Lincoln took a different stance. He questioned the war's justification. He introduced what became known as the spot resolutions, demanding to know the exact spot where American blood had been shed, as President Polk claimed. It was a bold move, and not a popular one. Many in his district were upset. Lincoln was labeled unpatriotic, even though he only wanted the truth. During this time, Lincoln also took a stand against slavery in the nation's capital. He proposed a bill to gradually abolish slavery in Washington, D.C., offering compensation to slaveholders and protection for freed people. It was a moderate, careful plan, but it gained little support. The issue was simply too explosive, and his party did not unite behind him. Though the bill failed, Lincoln's deep moral discomfort with slavery had now found a voice in national politics. True to his promise, Lincoln served only one term in Congress. When it ended in 1849, he did not seek re-election. President Zachary Taylor, also a Whig, offered Lincoln a job as governor of the Oregon Territory, far to the west. But Lincoln declined. The job would have taken him away from his family and from the legal and political world he was building in Illinois. Instead, he returned home to Springfield to resume his law career, stepping back from the national stage for a time. Back in Illinois, he threw himself into the law with renewed energy. He traveled from town to town on horseback or in a wagon, arguing cases in small courthouses, sleeping in inns, and spending long days on the dusty Midwestern roads. People came to know him not just as a lawyer, but as a peacemaker. He preferred to settle disputes rather than inflame them, and he used humor, honesty, and reason to calm heated emotions. In court, he was known for his storytelling. He didn't just argue facts, he painted pictures with his words. In one famous case, he used an almanac to prove that a witness could not have seen a crime at night, as the moon had not been visible. The courtroom was stunned. His client was acquitted, and Lincoln's legend grew. But even as he focused on law, the question of slavery continued to burn in his heart and in the nation. New laws, new territories, and new debates were stirring, and soon they would call Abraham Lincoln back into the political arena. His time in Congress had taught him much: the limits of compromise, the importance of truth, and the power of conviction. Though he had stepped away from the national spotlight, history was not done with him. In fact, it was just beginning to clear the stage for his greatest role: emergence as a national leader. For nearly a decade, Abraham Lincoln worked quietly in Springfield, building his law practice and raising a family. On the surface, it seemed as though he had left politics behind. He traveled across Illinois arguing cases in county courthouses, always carrying his worn briefcase and wearing the same rumpled black suit. But beneath this calm exterior, something powerful was brewing. The question of slavery, its place in America, its morality, and its future, was rising like a storm cloud over the nation. And that storm would soon pull Lincoln back into the center of history. The spark came in 1854 with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This law, pushed by Senator Stephen A. Douglas, allowed new territories to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. It shattered the fragile peace between North and South and threatened to spread slavery into areas that had long been free. For Lincoln, it was a breaking point. He had always believed that slavery was wrong, but now he saw that it could no longer be ignored or contained. The moral struggle had reached a tipping point. Though he held no office, Lincoln stood up. He began giving speeches again, at first in small towns, then larger cities. His words, once gentle and careful, now carried fire. He spoke not with anger but with deep conviction. In speech after speech, he reminded people of the promises in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, and warned that the country could not endure half slave and half free. His voice, slow and thoughtful, stirred the hearts of farmers, merchants, and workers across the Midwest. He was not a polished speaker, but he was real. And people listened. In 1856, Lincoln helped form the new Republican Party, a coalition of anti-slavery Whigs, Free Soilers, and former Democrats. It was a party built on a single burning idea: stopping the expansion of slavery. The political world was changing, and Lincoln was changing with it. That same year, he gave what became known as the Lost Speech in Bloomington, Illinois, a passionate call for unity and freedom. Reporters were so captivated they forgot to take notes. The words were lost, but the impact was not. Then came 1858, and the historic Senate race against Stephen A. Douglas, the man who had authored the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Lincoln, still relatively unknown outside Illinois, challenged Douglas to a series of debates. The two men met 7 times in towns, across the state, often outdoors, surrounded by thousands of curious citizens. It was not just a political contest, it was a battle of ideas, a struggle for the soul of the nation. Douglas was confident, experienced, and fiery. Lincoln was calm, deliberate, and principled. He spoke of a nation divided, of a moral crisis at hand. Though he lost the election, because senators were chosen by state legislatures at the time, Lincoln's words reached far beyond Illinois. Newspapers across the country published his speeches. His ideas, his integrity, and his quiet strength made him a rising star in national politics. By 1860, the Republican Party needed a candidate for president. Many expected a well-known name to win the nomination, but something remarkable happened. Delegates at the Republican National Convention in Chicago began turning to the man from the prairies. He was seen as honest, uncorrupted, and capable of uniting different factions. On the third ballot, Abraham Lincoln won the nomination. Cheers echoed through the hall. In that moment, the boy from the log cabin, the store clerk, the self-taught lawyer, had become the chosen leader of a movement. Later that year, Lincoln won the presidential election without a single vote from many Southern states. His election was seen as a threat by pro-slavery leaders, and within months, Southern states began to secede from the Union. The country was falling apart, and Lincoln had not yet taken office. But history had chosen its leader, a man shaped by loss and learning, who rose not by birth or wealth, but by courage and conviction. Abraham Lincoln had emerged, not as a conqueror, but as a servant, not as a man of war, but a man of truth. The nation was entering its darkest hour, and Lincoln, with quiet strength and steady hands, was preparing to guide it through the storm. Presidency and the Civil War. On a cold and uncertain March day in 1861, Abraham Lincoln stood at the steps of the U.S. Capitol to take the oath of office as the 16th President of the United States. The sky above was gray, and the mood in the country even darker. 7 Southern states had already declared their secession from the Union, and more would follow. As Lincoln placed his hand on the Bible, the future of the nation hung by a thread. He was not walking into a peaceful presidency. He was walking into a storm of division, anger, and the threat of war. In his first inaugural address, Lincoln reached out to the South with words of peace. He promised not to interfere with slavery where it already existed, hoping to avoid conflict. "We are not enemies, but friends," he said. But his gentle words could not stop what had already begun. Just weeks later, Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter, a Union fort in South Carolina. The Civil War had begun. The early days were filled with chaos. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to defend the Union. Some states answered the call with pride, while others, like Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee, chose instead to join the Confederacy. The country was breaking apart, and the battle lines were being drawn not just across the land, but through families, towns, and hearts. Lincoln was now a wartime president, but he had no military background and little experience in commanding generals. He had to learn quickly, choosing, firing, and replacing military leaders as the war dragged on. He listened carefully, studied strategy, and spent sleepless nights reading battle reports. More than anything, he searched for the right man to lead the Union Army. That man would eventually be Ulysses S. Grant. But Lincoln's war was not just fought on the battlefield. It was fought in minds and in laws, in speeches, and in the soul of the nation. He knew that this war was about more than land or politics. It was about freedom. At first he moved cautiously, afraid of losing support from border states that still allowed slavery. But as the war wore on and the cost of lives grew heavier, Lincoln saw clearly what had to be done. On January 1st, 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all slaves in Confederate states were now free. With the stroke of a pen, he changed the purpose of the war. It was no longer just about preserving the Union, it was about ending slavery. The document did not free all enslaved people immediately, but it sent a clear and powerful message. Freedom was the future of America. That same year, in a quiet Pennsylvania town called Gettysburg, a battle was fought that would shape history. Thousands of soldiers died over 3 bloody days. Later, Lincoln stood on that battlefield and gave a short speech, just 272 words, the Gettysburg Address. In it, he honored the fallen and reminded the nation of its founding promise that all men are created equal. His words echoed across the hills and into the hearts of Americans for generations to come. As the war continued, Lincoln faced endless criticism, political enemies, and personal sorrow. His beloved son Willie had died in the White House. His wife Mary struggled with grief and mental anguish. Still, Lincoln carried the weight of the nation on his shoulders, never turning away from the painful task before him. In 1864, with the war still raging, he ran for re-election. Many believed he would lose. The country was tired of war. But then came Union victories, Sherman's march through Georgia and the capture of Atlanta. Hope was renewed. Lincoln won in a landslide. In his second inaugural address, he spoke not with triumph but with humility. He called for healing, with malice toward none, with charity for all. And then, finally, the war came to an end. On April 9, 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The Union was preserved. Slavery was dying. Lincoln had done the impossible, but fate would not let him rest. Just 5 days later, on April 14th, Lincoln went to Ford's Theater with his wife. As he watched the play from the balcony, a man slipped into the box behind. Him, John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer. A single gunshot rang out. Lincoln slumped forward, never to awaken. He died the next morning. The nation wept. Abraham Lincoln had given everything, his mind, his strength, his spirit, and, finally, his life. He had led the country through its darkest hour and pointed it toward a brighter day. The log cabin boy who taught himself to read had become a martyr for freedom and unity. His presidency was not only a chapter of war, but a story of courage, compassion, and an unshakable belief that a nation, though wounded, could heal. Leadership and legacy. The leadership of Abraham Lincoln was not loud or boastful. It was quiet, patient, and deeply human. At first glance, he did not look like a man who could hold a nation together. He was tall and thin, with a face marked by years of hardship, and eyes that often seemed tired, even sad. But behind that solemn expression was a mind of remarkable clarity and a heart full of compassion. Lincoln did not lead with fear. He led with principle, purpose, and profound empathy. In the middle of a storm that tore the United States in two, he stood like a lighthouse, offering direction when there seemed to be none. During the Civil War, Lincoln had to make decisions that no president before him had ever faced. The Union was falling apart. Brothers were fighting brothers. Every choice could cost thousands of lives. He had to balance military strategy with political pressure, civil liberties with national security. In some cases, he took actions that were bold and controversial, such as suspending habeas corpus, allowing arrests without trial, and increasing executive powers. Critics called him a tyrant. Supporters called him a savior. But Lincoln was not chasing glory. He was trying to keep the United States from collapsing. One of his greatest talents was his ability to unite people who disagreed. His cabinet was famously made up of rivals, men who had run against him, who questioned his ideas and who had very different visions for the country. Yet Lincoln welcomed them all to the table. He listened more than he spoke. He asked questions. He took criticism without anger. Slowly, even those who doubted him came to admire his steady hand and humble wisdom. Outside the White House, the country was in chaos. Cities were divided. Soldiers died by the thousands. And through it all, Lincoln never stopped working, not just to win the war, but to win peace. He believed in healing, not revenge. Even as Union armies advanced and Confederate cities fell, he spoke of reconciliation. He dreamed of rebuilding a nation that could once again be a house undivided. His vision became most clear in his second inaugural address, spoken as the war neared its end. It was not a speech of victory. It was a speech of sorrow and hope. With malice toward none, with charity for all, he said. He spoke of forgiveness, of rebuilding, and of caring for those who have borne the battle, whether Union or Confederate. His words were not political, they were deeply moral. He reminded the people that the war had not only been a test of armies, but a test of the nation's soul. And Lincoln passed that test, not with a sword, but with a pen. With every letter, every law, every late-night decision, he shaped a new future. One of his most lasting achievements was pushing for the 13th Amendment, the law that would permanently abolish slavery in the United States. It was a fight even in the North. But Lincoln lobbied Congress tirelessly, knowing that the Emancipation Proclamation was not enough. On January 31, 1865, the amendment passed. Slavery would finally, legally, be ended. Lincoln's greatest moral battle had been won, but he never lived to see the peace he had dreamed of. Just days after the Confederate surrender, Lincoln was killed by an assassin's bullet. He did not return to Illinois as a president, but as a fallen hero. His funeral. Train traveled for nearly 2 weeks, stopping in towns and cities along the way. Millions of Americans lined the tracks, white and black, rich and poor, mourning the man who had carried their hopes. Yet Lincoln's story did not end with his death. In many ways, it was only beginning. Over the years, his legend grew. People remembered the boy who had taught himself to read in a log cabin, the lawyer who had walked miles to help a client, the president who had kept the Union together with courage and compassion. Schools were named after him. Statues were built in his honor. His face was carved into mountains and printed on pennies. The Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. stands as a temple, not just to a man, but to the values he lived and died for: freedom, unity, and the dignity of all people. But perhaps Lincoln's greatest legacy is not carved in stone. It is felt in the spirit of the country. His life reminds us that greatness does not come from wealth or status, but from honesty, humility, and a deep love for others. He showed that one person, armed with moral courage and a clear purpose, can truly change the course of history. Even today, his words still echo through time. In courtrooms and classrooms, in protests and prayers, in every moment when the nation struggles with division, Americans turn once again to Lincoln, for wisdom, for inspiration, and for the hope that even in darkness we can find a better way forward. Assassination and death. The war was finally over. The cannons had fallen silent. The streets of Washington, D.C. were filled with celebration. Flags waved, bells rang, and strangers embraced one another in the streets. After 4 long and bloody years, the Union had been preserved. President Abraham Lincoln, weary but hopeful, began to breathe again, not for himself, but for the wounded nation he had fought so hard to save. He spoke of rebuilding, of forgiveness, of bringing the South back, not with punishment, but with peace. The future was fragile, but it was full of promise. On the evening of April 14, 1865, just 5 days after General Robert E. Lee's surrender, at Appomattox, President Lincoln decided to enjoy a rare moment of rest. He and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, accepted an invitation to attend a play at Ford's Theatre. The production was a popular comedy called Our American Cousin. It was meant to be a night of laughter and relief, a night to forget the sorrow of war, if only for a little while. The Lincolns arrived to a warm welcome. As they stepped into the presidential box above the stage, the audience stood and applauded. The president smiled and bowed, his tall figure framed against the red curtain. He looked more tired than triumphant, but there was a quiet peace in his face. He had done what few had thought possible. He had saved the Union, and now he hoped to heal it. But in the shadows of that same theater, another man was waiting, John Wilkes Booth, a well-known actor and a fierce Confederate sympathizer. Booth believed that by killing Lincoln, he could strike a final blow for the South. He had planned the assassination carefully, slipping into the theater he knew so well. At 10:15 p.m., during the play's funniest line, when the audience erupted in laughter, Booth crept behind Lincoln, raised a pistol, and fired a single shot into the back of the president's head. Chaos exploded in the theater. Mary screamed. Major Henry Rathbone, the Lincolns' guest, leapt at Booth but was slashed with a knife. Booth jumped from the balcony to the stage, breaking his leg in the fall. Still he managed to escape, shouting "Sic semper tyrannis," Latin for "thus always to tyrants." The crowd was stunned, frozen between disbelief and terror. Lincoln was unconscious. He was carried across the street to a small boarding house, Peterson House, where doctors worked desperately to save him. Mary Todd Lincoln held his hand, weeping beside his still body. Cabinet members and friends gathered in silence, watching the man who had carried the hopes of millions slip away. There were no grand speeches, no last words. Just the slow, labored breaths of a man leaving this world. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, standing at the bedside, broke the silence. Now he belongs to the ages. The news swept across the nation like a thunderclap. People gathered in churches, on street corners, and outside newspaper offices, many too shocked to speak. In the North, grief was overwhelming. Grown men wept openly. Bells tolled. Flags flew at half-staff. In the South, even some of Lincoln's former enemies mourned his loss, realizing that the man who had offered mercy would no longer guide the nation's healing. A manhunt for Booth followed. 12 days later, he was found hiding in a barn in Virginia. Refusing to surrender, he was shot and killed by Union soldiers. The other members of the assassination plot were captured and tried. Some were executed. Justice was served, but the wound left by Lincoln's death would never fully heal. Lincoln's funeral was one of the largest in American history. His body lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda, where thousands waited in long, silent lines to pay their respects. Then began the long journey home. His coffin was placed on a funeral train called the Lincoln Special, which traveled over 1,600 miles, stopping in cities and towns from Washington to Springfield, Illinois. At every stop, mourners gathered to see the face of the man who had given his life for their freedom. On May 4, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was laid to rest in Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield. He was buried beside his young son Willie, whose death had so deeply wounded him during the war. The words etched into the marble tomb were simple yet eternal. Now he belongs to the ages. But Lincoln's story did not end in that quiet grave. His ideas, his courage, and his belief in the dignity of all people lived on. He had changed the nation not just with laws, but with love, for truth, for justice, and for his fellow man. In life, he was a leader. In death, he became a legend. Funeral and legacy. As the smoke of the Civil War faded, so too did the light of Abraham Lincoln's life, but not his presence. His death was not the end of a man, it was the birth of a legend. Across the grieving nation, people did not just mourn the president. They mourned a father, a guide, a symbol of something greater than politics, hope, unity, and the belief that the soul of a nation could be shaped by compassion. Lincoln's funeral was unlike anything the United States had ever seen. His body lay in state in the East Room of the White House, where the great and humble alike came to pay their final respects. Then his casket was carried to the Capitol, placed beneath the great dome he had fought to preserve. There, in silence, broken only by muffled footsteps and sobs, thousands passed by to say goodbye. Children clutched their mothers' hands. Veterans saluted with trembling arms. Former slaves wept openly, knowing that the man who had helped break their chains was now gone. But Lincoln's journey was not yet over. On April 21, 1865, his coffin was placed aboard a funeral train, the Lincoln Special. The train followed a long winding route from Washington, D.C. to Springfield, Illinois, retracing the same path he had taken to the Capitol 4 years earlier. In every city it stopped: Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, Cleveland, Chicago. Massive crowds gathered. Black and white, rich and poor, soldiers and civilians, they stood side by side in silence, hats over their hearts, some reaching out just to touch the train as it passed. It was as if the entire nation had become one long line of mourners stretching across the land. On May 4, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was laid to rest in Oak Ridge Cemetery, not far from the log cabin where his journey had begun. He was buried beside his beloved son Willie, the man who had risen from the soil of Kentucky and walked barefoot through Indiana was now carried by a nation he had helped save. And yet, Lincoln never truly left. His legacy lives in stone, in words, and in the spirit of a country that still looks to him in times of doubt. His face is carved into mountains. His statue sits tall and solemn in Washington, D.C., where millions visit the Lincoln Memorial and read the words that defined his life. That government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. But Lincoln's legacy is more than monuments and memorials. It lives in the laws he helped create, like the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. It lives in the idea that leadership is not about domination, but about empathy and service. It lives in the understanding that even in our darkest hours, we can rise, united by the belief that freedom belongs to all. For generations, presidents, poets, and protesters have turned to Lincoln's memory for guidance. His image is printed on pennies and carved into classrooms. His name is invoked in speeches and sermons. And yet perhaps his most lasting gift is the reminder that greatness can come from humility, and that moral courage can shape the course of history. Lincoln was not perfect. He was a man of his time, struggling with impossible questions, making painful decisions and carrying the weight of a fractured nation. But he never turned away from the burden. He walked straight into it, armed only with honesty, wisdom, and an unshakable faith in the American promise. In the end, Abraham Lincoln's life was not just a personal journey. It was a reflection of the country he loved, flawed but striving, broken but hopeful. From the log cabin to the White House, from battlefields to burial grounds, his story became America's story, and that story, like Lincoln's legacy, will never truly end. If this story touched your heart or helped you learn something new, give it a like, share it with a friend, and leave a comment below. Don't forget to subscribe. Your support helps us bring more meaningful and powerful stories to life on LMJ English. Here are 20 key vocabulary words that are repeated throughout the Abraham Lincoln story, along with their English explanations. Emancipation, the act of freeing someone from slavery or oppression. In the context of Lincoln, it refers to the freeing of enslaved people. Union refers to the United States, especially the northern states that remained together during the Civil War. Slavery, the system where people were treated as property and forced to work without freedom or pay, which Lincoln fought to abolish. Legacy, something that someone leaves behind after they die, such as achievements, values, or impact on history. Presidency, the period of time during which someone serves as president. Assassination, the deliberate killing of a public or political figure, especially for ideological or political reasons. Cabinet, a group of advisors chosen by the president to help lead different parts of the government. Civil War, a war between people of the same country. In this story, the war between the northern and southern states of the U.S. abolish, to completely end or stop something, especially a law, system, or practice like slavery. Inauguration, a formal ceremony to mark the beginning of someone's term as president or Congress, the legislative branch of the U.S. government responsible for making laws. Lincoln served as a congressman. Reconstruction, the period after the Civil War when the southern states were brought back into the Union and the country tried to rebuild. Reconciliation, the act of bringing together people or groups who were in conflict or disagreement, especially after the war. Amendment, a change or addition to a legal or official document. Lincoln supported the 13th Amendment to end slavery. Oratory, the skill of public speaking often used to persuade or inspire. Lincoln was famous for his speeches. Self-educated, describes someone who has taught themselves rather than learning. Through formal education. Justice, the idea of fairness, moral rightness, and the application of the law, a value that guided Lincoln's actions. Humble, having or showing a modest view of one's own importance. Lincoln was often described as a humble leader. Constitution, the fundamental laws and principles that govern a country. Lincoln aimed to protect and preserve the U.S. Constitution. Equality, the state of being equal in status, rights, and opportunities, a core belief in Lincoln's vision for America.